tested. Come on and test your hypothesis, cause you're gonna learn a lot if you want to stay here. That is the Science Cafe.
Welcome to another episode of Science Cafe New Hampshire. We are well into our 11th year providing a forum for the public and our experts to discuss various scientific topics. My name is Rick Irving, and I will be your host and moderator for this, our January 2022 episode entitled, Why Should We Follow the Science? In our world today, science forms the foundation of modern life. Technology permeates our existence, and analysis abounds in every dimension of our lives. So it becomes critical that ordinary people understand what science tells us today, how science evolves over time, and how to interpret science as knowledge grows and nuances emerge. The pandemic has given us a great example of how science can be both a guide and can also add to confusion. But there are many other areas as well, with the accelerated pace of science demands that we pay attention and think diligently about what science can and cannot tell us. Gene editing, geoengineering, cold fusion are just a few examples of science making progress, but the answers still remain far from clear. Tonight, Science Cafe explores the question of how to interpret science and the complexities it represents. Why should we believe what science tells us? How should we deal with it when it changes? If science is a cumulative practice, what is our responsibility in shaping, regulating, or restricting scientific exploration? And importantly, how can non-scientists still be informed citizens? To help us figure this all out, we have assembled an exceptional panel tonight, and it should be an educational and entertaining discussion. Before I introduce the panel, I have a few quick procedural comments for our audience, especially to our first-time viewers. A vital part of Science Cafe are the questions submitted by you, our audience, to our expert panel. To submit your questions, use the comment section of Facebook or YouTube, whichever you're using to join us tonight. Our colleagues will collect the questions and forward them along to us to direct them to the panel. Please be succinct with your questions, and if you would, please include your name and location, which is used purely for general information purposes only. You may start submitting your questions now and for the remainder of tonight's program. As always, we will get to as many of your questions as our time permits. And now, it is my privilege to introduce you to our panelists for tonight. As I said, we have a very accomplished set of individuals on a panel tonight, and I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Robert Crease. Bob is joining us from New York State. He has his bachelor's degree from Amherst College, PhD from Columbia. He is currently the chairman and a professor in the Department of Philosophy at Stony Brook University in New York. He's also the co-editor of a scholarly journal, Physics in Perspective, and he writes a monthly column for Critical Point, an international publication. 2007, he was elected to the Fellow of American Physical Society in the United States, as well as the Institute of Physics in London. He has written, co-written, translated, edited dozens and dozens of papers, and he's shown up in a lot of technical publications. Bob, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Rick.
Okay, so would you just take a few minutes and tell the audience about your background, your interests, and what it is that you do?
Sure. I'm a philosopher and historian of science, and I'm particularly interested in how science gets its authority and how it loses it, and how it can get it back. And I've written about that. I have a recent book about the rise and fall of scientific authority. But to sort of condense what I want to say, I want to show you a picture. Can you, see that picture there? That person is comfortable. And why is that person comfortable? Because there are stories in his head that tell him that he's in a comfortable environment, that he doesn't have to worry about anything around him. So the short version of why we need to follow the science is that science gives us this kind of perspective on ourselves. It allows us to sort of stand back and see what the dangers are. Now, to me, though, what's more important, what's more interesting is the question of how we get him off the tracks. And there's two different tactics to use, I think. One of which is by force, by passing laws and legislation and having policemen and putting up fences and so forth. But when we do that it doesn't change his thinking. It doesn't change the stories in his head. In fact, he'll resent it. And the other way is somehow to change the stories in his head so that he realizes that he's in a dangerous situation. So that's my general take on the authority of science, and we can talk about it later.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. Next panelist is Dr. Alex Toker. He's joining us from Boston. He got his bachelor's degree at King's College at the University of London, his PhD from the National Institute of Medical Research in London. He is currently professor of pathology at Harvard Medical School for the last 24 years and a professor of pathology at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center for 22 years. He's also affiliated with Dana-Farber Cancer Center and the Ludwig Center at Harvard. He's also done research with Tufts Medical School, and his research is focused on cell and molecular biology of cancer. Fascinating stuff. Also has quite an impressive list of publications. So, Alex, thank you for joining us, and would you tell us about yourself?
Thank you, Rick, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's a real pleasure to be here and to chat with you all this evening. As Rick said, I'm a professor of pathology at Harvard Medical School in Boston, and I'm really here in sort of wearing two hats. I direct a research laboratory at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, focusing on deciphering the molecular and cellular basis for cancer, with a particular focus in breast cancer. But largely, I'm here to represent the publishing industry, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Biological Chemistry, which is one of the oldest journals in the biomedical field, dating back to 1905 when it was first founded. And it is a journal that disseminates scientific manuscripts, discoveries in the fields of cell and molecular biology and biochemistry. And it is a society-run journal. It is run by the ASBMB, or the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, and has been for over 100 years. And it is a journal run by scientists and for scientists, where we take manuscripts, they are peer-reviewed by peers, by experts in the field, and then, based on those recommendations, are published. And the science is therefore disseminated to the public, to both scientists and non-scientists alike, to advance scientific knowledge. And I'm really here to discuss and present the way that science is disseminated in the form of the publication of manuscripts from research that is done in the biomedical field that is largely funded by the taxpayer, by people such as yourselves, because a lot of the research, a considerable portion of the research in the biomedical field is funded from the National Institutes of Health, funded by the taxpayer. And so we have a duty and a responsibility to communicate science to not only our peers, but to the public at large. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you, Alex. I'm actually fascinated to hear that process as we go forward tonight. And we also have Dr. Jonathan Marino. Jonathan is joining us from Washington, D.C. He has a bachelor's degree in philosophy and psychology from Hofstra in New York. His PhD is from the Washington University in St. Louis. He has a number of honors, the Andrew Mellon Postdoctorate Fellowship, an honorary doctorate from Hofstra, a recipient of the Benjamin Rush Medal from the College of William and Mary Law School, the Dr. Jean Mayer Award for Global Citizenship from Tufts. He's also a Penn Alumni Faculty Award of Merit winner and an honorary visiting fellowship in history at the University of Kent in Canterbury, England. And in 2018, the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities presented him with their Lifetime Achievement Award. He is currently a professor of medical ethics and health and policy at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's also part of the Pennsylvania Integration Knowledge platform at Pennsylvania. He's authored many technical journals, both internationally and domestically. And his most recent book I thought was pretty interesting. It has a very thought-provoking title. It's called Everybody Wants to Go to Heaven, but Nobody Wants to Die. Jonathan, welcome. We're so glad to have you here. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Rick. Well, let's see. I was born in a log cabin. It was a very modest beginning. So I am also trained as a philosopher, though. Like Robert, I do a kind of combination of philosophy and history of science for a living. I started out when I first started teaching philosophy at George Washington University in the late 1970s, there was an opportunity to be part of an experimental course, as it was known then, in bioethics. And so I did for about 15 years work as a clinical ethicist, often at the bedside, dealing with actual ethics cases in hospitals. But by the mid-1990s, I turned more toward policy issues. So for the last, you can count 25 years or so, I've been involved in ethical issues around national security, human experiments, most recently neurotechnology and neuroethics. I suppose the place I would start tonight is with the question, what do Americans think of when they think of science? I think in the 1960s, and when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, most Americans thought of the bomb and the space program. The physical sciences and engineering, I think, dominated the way Americans thought about science and scientists. This started to change in the mid-70s with the advent of recombinant DNA, something Alex knows a lot more about than I do, and the birth of the first so-called test tube baby, Louise Brown, in 1978. I think there's been a shift in the public consciousness about science from physics and engineering to the life sciences. And the life sciences now, of course, are a special focus. Everybody's become an epidemiologist and an immunologist in the last 2.5 years or so with the pandemic. What I think is so interesting now about the reservations that people have about about science and the denialism and misinformation is that most of the time when scientists do their work, they're doing it in highly technical settings, in journals like the ones that Alex and Robert are involved with, in high-end conferences, also at the other extreme, around dinner tables, chatting with their colleagues. It can take years or even decades for scientists to reach a consensus. But with a public health emergency, it's very difficult to get your arms around exactly what's going on. It's a moving target. We're in a dynamic situation. And so the general public is now sort of watching the way that scientists are coming to terms with a problem in a much more intimate and direct and open way than is usually the case. So part of the problem right now is that things are changing, and as Senator Patrick Moynihan once said, and my views change when the facts change. What about you? But that is really a hard pill to swallow when there's so much riding on the scientific consensus as there is now.
Hard pill to swallow, maybe, but I like the statement. So now, the first question is going to be I'll put to each one of the panelists individually, and it is, in a paragraph or less, what would your response be to why should we trust science? Bob, would you like to go first?
I'll give it a shot. You can compare science to a workshop and or a greenhouse, let's say. It's a special kind of environment in which you can make special kinds of things. You can make them and test them independently of the world outside. So you can create things like subatomic particles or chemical reactions or tissues and play around with them and measure them and understand them apart from the influences outside. Now, what's interesting to me though is that and when you do that, you can understand better the world, the more wild world outside the workshop. But what's of interest to me is how and why should people outside the workshop, how can they come to understand and appreciate the work that's taking place in the workshop? So it's that kind of interface, which is the overcoming that kind of interface is what I'm concerned with.
Great, thank you. Alex, would you like to take a shot?
I will. I'll do my best. So I hate to quote or paraphrase another scientist, but that's exactly what I'm going to do in terms of why should we trust science. And it's a quote that I suspect many of you have heard or have at least heard mentioned, and that is one by Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist, who's very vocal. in his ideas and thoughts, both on social media and in the public. And one of his more famous quotes is that the great thing about science is that it's true whether you believe in it or not. Now that can generate a lot of reaction, both negative and positive in certain people, but I think it does illustrate in a very simple and effective manner, certainly what I love about science, is that it is an empirical method. It is a method by which we can determine whether something is true. It stands up to the test of experimentation and gives you an answer about the physical world, the natural world that we live in. One of the things that I often say to graduate students who join my lab or who are interested in doing research in my lab is, I often get the question is, what do you love about science? And it sounds a little bit nerdy or geeky, but the answer that I often give is that one of the great things that I really find exciting about a result to an experiment that we devise to try to test a hypothesis is that we get a result. And while it may have problems associated with it that are technical or otherwise in nature, there's a very good chance that the result of that experiment, you are the very first person on the planet to have seen that result. And that is a very powerful message. And assuming it stands up to the test, the empirical test of the scientific method, it is reproduced by others, it is validated, etc. That really advances our knowledge. Whether it is understanding the basic way that the physical and natural world works, or how things go awry, such as in human disease. That's what I love about science, and that's why I think we should trust science. Thank you, Rick.
Okay, very, very interesting, Alex. Thank you. And Jonathan, why should we trust science?
There's an expression that I like called fiduciary knowledge, and that's the idea that, just as I go to my tax accountant because I hope that she will fill out my tax forms properly, even though I'm going to sign them and not really understand what she did. Or if I go to a lawyer and say, look, I'm being threatened with a lawsuit, what do I do? Very personally, for so many of us, if I have a serious medical problem and I go to a medical doctor, what do I do? I trust these people. And why do I trust them? Well, because they are fiduciaries. They have a special obligation of care in their particular areas, whether it's accounting or the law or medicine. And I really don't have a whole lot of choice. I can do some forum shopping and go to another accountant or another lawyer or certainly another physician and ask for another opinion. But in the final analysis, I have to trust people who appear to have expertise and have been confirmed or certified by peers as having expertise, or by a government entity, some public agency that says they have this expertise. We do this all the time. I think a problem with science, particularly as I've suggested a few minutes ago, in the last 30 or 40 years, is that the fiduciaries now have an opportunity to manage what we are. And this is the difference between sort of physics and engineering and the biology. It seems much more immediate when you're talking about what's going on in my body. And the question that has arisen in the last, I think, particularly in the last 20 years or so, is not so much should I trust the science, but should I trust the scientists? If you look at some surveys that have been done about the public, and sort of trust in science has diminished, particularly among people who identify as political conservatives since the late 1970s, and perhaps accelerated more recently. There are worries about what people like Alex and Robert, when they do their work and when they comment on science, when they actually do their science, what are they doing? What are their values? What are their goals? They're publishing in these esoteric journals. I myself read articles by people like Alex and really don't understand what the hell they're talking about most of the time. They're very technical. I've gone to many lectures by colleagues in science, very hard to understand them. In many ways, a scientist at a place like Stony Brook or Harvard or Penn has more in contact with her counterpart in China than she might have with her next door neighbor in her neighborhood. There's a whole universe of science and of scientists that I, as a non-scientist, have a very hard time penetrating. and given all the other pressures that we're under right now in the pandemic, this I think has really exacerbated a sense that we don't really know what these scientists are up to.
Great, thank you. So you've all actually touched on the flip side of this question, so we'll just ask it straight out, and we'll go in the same order. Why are there people who distrust science from your perspective? Bob, you want to go first?
I'll give it a shot. I think the answer is that the very strengths of science are also its weaknesses. The very things that make it go also make it vulnerable to being to people being skeptical. So, for instance, it's fallible, meaning it's open-ended. So, whenever you make a scientific assertion, it's always possible that that with new evidence, the result will be changed. It's institutional. It's communal. So it takes place within an institution, and it's technical and abstract. Now, each of those are make it possible for people who disagree with the findings to object, because if it's technical and abstract, they can say, "Oh, I just don't understand it." And we saw people like the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court saying, all this mathematics about gerrymandering, I don't understand it. So I don't have to pay attention to it. It's also for fallibility too. People say, well, if you just wait long enough, maybe the science will change. Not all the facts are in, so let's not be too hasty. And it's institutional, meaning it takes place within a community. There's checks and cross checks, but that also means that sometimes these institutions can have their own kind of interests. They can become something like big pharma, where you don't trust. There's other interests involved. So that's one of the things you have to understand, is the things that make science go also make it vulnerable to being dismissed. Now, as to the question of, so what do you do? How do you address this? The last thing you do is throw more science at these people. The last thing you do is view this as a teaching opportunity. Because that just makes people who object to the particular position feel patronized and talked down to. And I just finished a book about an episode of science denial lately, and I saw this firsthand of people of cases where scientists viewed teaching the public, talking to the public who had fears about a certain scientific institution, and the scientists wound up angering the public even more by treating them as being irrational and ignorant, and that they were going to teach them what was up. So the question of telling people of overcoming resistance is very difficult, and involves things other than throwing more scientific studies at them.
Very interesting. So, Alex, why do you think people distrust science?
Well, thank you, Rick. It's a very complicated question, and there are many, many different ways of looking at it. I'm going to, just for the sake of brevity, take a stab at two issues that I think are important and that need to be addressed. The first is, might seem obvious, but scientists are people too. And just like there are bad guys in all cross sections of society, in all professions, there are people who are out to deceive in science as well. I would argue that these are largely in the minority, and that the majority of scientists are out to do good, to make important discoveries that advance knowledge and human health in a positive way. But there's always going to be a small cross-section of those scientists who have an agenda that is driven by alternative motive. One of the other thing that I wanted to bring up is, as a journal editor, and it really interfaces with the first point, is that one of the ways that this illustrates itself is that when manuscripts are published, papers are published reporting on discoveries in molecular biology and biochemistry, etc., one of the major issues that I have to deal with as an editor-in-chief of a major biomedical journal are issues with manipulation of data, plagiarism, image manipulation. And this has really become a major problem in the biomedical literature, where people are out to deceive other scientists, the public, the funding bodies, the government, etc., by manipulating data and presenting essentially falsified data. This has become a major, major scourge, and is one of the reasons, rightly so, that I think that the public has started to, or has increased its distrust of science. Again, I would argue that this is largely in the minority. This has received a lot of attention in both the scientific press and in the regular press lately. And one of the things that I spend most of my time addressing as journal editor, it is addressable. There are many tools that are both technology driven, but largely require human intervention to address and catch the culprits and admonish them in the appropriate way. And I suspect many of my colleagues know exactly what I'm talking about. But I think this is one of the reasons, at least in the present day, why there is a distrust of science. There are many, many other reasons. But in my experience and what I spend most of my time dealing with as a journal editor, this is a major one. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you. That was very interesting, Alex. I appreciate your response. And so the same question to Jonathan.
Well, part of the answer is, as we were saying before, as I was saying before, there is a kind of cultural difference between scientists and non-scientists that involves technical language and very esoteric conversations, and also increasingly involves money. There's a lot of money in science, and most people don't have money, and most people don't have access to all of the fancy assets, the equipment and the person power and so forth that money can buy. So it's a little intimidating to go into a lab or be in a modern hospital in a setting which seems really so alien and unfamiliar to most people. What Alex just said, though, I think is really quite important. There's a sort of ironically, science manufactures its own criticism. It is inherently a self-critical process. The late 19th century philosopher with whom Robert will certainly be familiar, Charles Peirce, said, science is really the only reliable way to fix belief, but it is that way precisely because it does involve self-criticism. Somebody else comes along and comes up with some anomalous piece of data that doesn't fall into the general view, and then what do you do with that? Back to the drawing board in some cases. So this is, I think, an interesting difference between the process of thinking that scientists go through, the manipulation of the natural world, which is really difficult, and in which there are so many variables and different people can have different legitimate points of view. Evidence is usually inconclusive, and you have to move on to the next piece of the question that you've created for yourself. But the way that scientists criticize each other and raise questions about each other's conclusions can cause non-scientists to think, well, these guys really don't know what the hell they're talking about.
Thank you so much for all of your answers. I appreciate that. The next question is, what is the scientific method? And we'll open it up for who would like to answer first.
I'll be happy to take a go.
Alex, please.
So now, of course, I speak on behalf of my colleagues in the world of biology, biomedical research. And what is a scientific method? One thing that I think dovetails with what we were just talking about now is that perhaps most people outside of science don't fully appreciate, and in fact, some scientists don't actually appreciate or practice what is the general scientific method. Again, in biology, I won't comment on the scientific method in chemistry, physics, astrophysics, etc. But in biology and medicine, the basic premise of the scientific method is that you devise a hypothesis about how something works. Let's say how some gene is dysregulated in cancer. And the goal of the scientific method is to set out a number of experiments to disprove that hypothesis. And you keep doing so until you have arrived at a situation where you can no longer disprove the hypothesis, so that the ultimate outcome is that you have proven the hypothesis. Unfortunately, many scientists, because they are human, tend to set out experiments in a manner that actually sets out to prove the hypothesis in the first place. And because there's a large number of potential explanations for any given result in a biological system that is inherently supremely complex, it generally isn't too complicated or too difficult to prove something. And so I think we've tended to move away from disproving a hypothesis because, if you try and publish a result where you're disproving something, it's not terribly interesting or exciting. It's much more interesting to sort of say, oh, look, I've discovered something, I proved it in this way, and here's what it means. But really, the proper scientific method, again, in biomedical research, is to define a hypothesis about how something works in the natural world and to set out to disprove it. And when you have failed to disprove it using different approaches, then the most likely outcome is that the hypothesis is correct and you have made a major discovery.
Thank you very much. Bob or Jonathan, anything to add before we go on to the next question?
Well, I'll just jump in. My dissertation director in grad school was the longtime editor of the Journal of Philosophy of Science, and his brief formula was along the lines that Alex is just talking about: hypothesize, infer, and test. The HIT method, we used to call it, and we used to call him the hit man. So that is, one way of describing the process of science. I think there's another angle that we often don't think about, non-scientists at least don't think about, which is often called the economy of science. There are so many different hypotheses that you could choose from which you could choose to derive an inference, and which inferences you could choose to test. Which ones do you decide to go for? So very often in modern science, the answer to that is again, where can you get the grant? And so grant funding, the source of the money to do science, which is modern science, very expensive, very time consuming. That's a big driver of what happens in science. I think the really interesting example recently, again, referring to the pandemic, is the way that work started on the coronavirus 20 years ago. People don't realize that these vaccines we have now are rooted in work that's been done for decades, arguably back to the 1960s. A decision was made by a few people, fortunately for us, to pursue vaccines for various forms of coronavirus. And only now is that, that bill is now being paid, and it's a darn good thing that it is. But, there are also in the medical world orphan diseases, as they're called, that don't get a lot of money. Sickle cell is one. There's a real crisis coming, I think, with sickle cell therapies. There are some new CRISPR-based therapies that are going to be coming on board. But, that's going to be very expensive, and many people who have sickle cell can't afford to get access to those therapies. Right. So the process of science is to a very great extent driven by where the money is.
Great, Jonathan. Thank you very much for that answer. I didn't realize that the study of these, like coronavirus, for example, had gone back so many years. Bob, before we go on, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, just a quick thing. It's sort of dangerous to ask a philosopher about the scientific method because I'm familiar with many, many different traditions, and there are different approaches. You can look at how you prove and disprove hypotheses, but also how do you come up with hypotheses and how do you test in the first place? I once read of someone, a biologist, who was looking for new kinds of squirrels, and what she would do is take a dog around and hold the dog up to holes in trees, and the dog would bark or not bark. And she said, that's my method. Is it scientific? Yeah. It's how I do science. So how you do, what the scientific method is depends on the field, and it depends on what you're looking at, whether you're looking at disproving hypotheses or whether you're looking at coming up with hypotheses and intuitions and hunches in the first place.
Great. Thank you.
That whole, I just said that whole question of how you do come up with a hypothesis that is going to be fruitful is a terrific question. It's one that philosophers have been interested in, and psychologists more recently for a long time. What is it? Is it an intuition, as Robert says? Is it a hunch? Is it something that occurs to you when you're taking a shower, or something that occurs to you over dinner with colleagues? Yeah, it is a rich area.
Even whether there is a method or not. I mean, Vannevar Bush wrote, there is no scientific method.
Yeah. We'll plow money into everything we can, and we'll see what comes of it.
See what works, as the pragmatists used to say.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so now the next question maybe can help people understand how this all works. What is a control and why is it critical?
Well, when you do an experiment, there's a lot of noise, as I think my colleagues will agree. This is a big problem, sort of in my own area of interest, which is the ethics of clinical trials. So you can compare one drug to another in the natural course of events, but that's not going to be very reliable unless you have massive quantities of data and study subjects. So in order to get the cleanest numbers that you can, you will control an experiment with an experimental drug. With perhaps an inert substance or placebo. And that's the way to get the cleanest data. Interestingly, that's also been a problem with the experiments with the coronavirus vaccine. Some people think that, they weren't properly controlled. They weren't thoroughly controlled, that things have moved a little too quickly. And that has made some people, I think, unnecessarily nervous. But controls are basically ways to get the cleanest possible result that you can.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so I would certainly agree with what Jonathan just said. And, in our field, in cancer biology, but largely in all of research in biology and medicine, controls are what we live or die for. I mean, really, what determines whether the outcome of your experiment can be believed, whether your hypothesis holds up to the test of the experiment or not. And it can actually be further broken down into negative controls and positive controls, which are as important as one another. That is to determine whether the result that you are observing with a particular drug that you have administered to an animal or even a patient in a clinical trial has occurred either by chance or has actually been comes about because of the action of the drug itself and not by chance. And so in the case of a clinical trial, if you're administering a drug that you are testing for patients, is there efficacy of that drug at removing disease burden, for example? And has that occurred by chance, by some other way that you are essentially completely blind to, you don't know, or is it because truly the drug is effective? Mm-hmm. And the only way to know that is by having, in this case, a negative control. A positive control would be to have a drug that is already existing, has already gone through the pipeline, works, and how it works. And when you throw that into the experiment, will give you the anticipated result. Hmm. Because, science is complex. Results can come about for a number of different ways that you cannot even anticipate. And so having controls such as these really tells you that the way you design the experiment gives you the right answer, if there is such a thing as the right answer.
Great, thank you so much. Bob, do you have anything to add before we go on to the next? It's actually another process question.
No, I think Jonathan and Alex had it.
Very good answers. So the next one is, what is peer-reviewed science and why is it important? Bob, you want to try that one first?
No, I'd like to listen to Alex and Jonathan. I did have a grad student working on well, now that you've got me started, I did have a grad student who was working on peer review, which is why usually anonymity in gets a bad rap nowadays. Anonymity is what allows trolls on the internet and so forth. But peer review is a method of using anonymity positively. That is by getting different multiple trained eyes on the same thing in order to check it out and look for flaws.
Let me take a stab at this as a journal editor-in-chief, which is largely what peer review is what I do for a lot of my time. And it is essentially a method by which science results of scientific experiments, which are written down and submitted to journals across all disciplines, This is not just biomedical research, but physics, chemistry, mathematics, etc. And are then to journals, of which there are thousands. And then the editors of these journals submit these to peer reviewers, who are experts in the subject matter of that paper, of that manuscript, of that study, and then evaluate its merit. And then will communicate their views on the merit of that study to the journal editors, who will then make a decision as to whether the study is sound, requires additional work, or should be published. And so it is generally a mechanism which is blinded. That is to say, the authors do not know who the reviewers are, okay, to maintain anonymity. And this is a process that has been in place for hundreds, well, certainly 100 years, at least in the biomedical literature, but has undergone somewhat of a revolution in the last decade or two with the advent of open access, which I won't go into unless somebody in the audience wants me to go into that. Has undergone a revolution because of open review. That is to say, the authors and reviewers are no longer blinded to one another. There is no anonymity, and this is an evolving landscape. The reason peer review is so important is because it has been proven through trial and error that it is an effective way, not without its problems, but it is an effective way of judging the merit of scientific study by experts in the field. And not generally one person, but by multiple reviewers or experts in the field of a given manuscript. And so, in our journal, we receive thousands of manuscripts for publication every year. And they have to be judged based on their merit. Are they high quality? Do they present new findings? Do they present findings that corroborate prior information? Do they have problems of plagiarism, misinformation, data manipulation? Many, many different issues which we as editors and peers have to review and judge whether the paper, the manuscript, merits dissemination to the scientific audience. Ultimately, many papers do get published, and they are a way of, this is how we disseminate science. And they will be taken by those working in that field to look at, decide whether they agree or disagree, reproduce those findings or not. And this is largely over the last sort of 100 years or so been the way that science has progressed.
Interesting. Now, if I may follow up on that, you said in the blind review, you don't know who is actually reviewing this. As an editor, do you get to sort of peek behind the curtain and find those things out, or is it not revealed even to somebody like you that's going to publish?
No, so editors do have, after all, the editors are the ones who choose the peer reviewers of a given manuscript. And in fact, that is the whole point. We choose reviewers who are expert in a given manuscript, in a given field, all right? Because we want to choose those who really have demonstrated expertise.
Right.
Okay? And so we as editors know this. Now, of course, this is fully confidential. This is not divulged in any way. It is behind a closed system. So the authors don't know who the reviewers are. And it is a way to maintain anonymity. Now, this has come under fire, of course, because you can imagine that reviewers may have an agenda, may have an axe to grind with a particular author. They may have a disagreement with an author. So we, of course, there are ways to sort of deal with this. And this is one of our main jobs as journal editors, to avoid instances like this, to institute a culture of fairness in the entire system. But again, scientists, both authors and reviewers, are humans, and they make mistakes, they have agendas, and it is our job to maintain a certain level of fairness in the system. But problems do arise, and one of the major things that I have to deal with on a daily basis is problems arising. Now, I should say that in response to these kinds of problems, there has been a revolution in the journal field, in the field of publishing, that has resulted in, for example, doing away with blind review, whereby now the names of reviewers are offered to authors, so they know exactly who's reviewing their paper. Not all journals do this. Some are piloting this as a trial system. Some have put it in place. I would argue that's in the minority at the moment. And it's by no means certain how this is going to shake out in the next 5 to 10 years. whether we are going to maintain a system of anonymity in peer review, or we are going to get to a point where it's going to be fully open, non-anonymous reviewing. And I certainly have mixed feelings about this, because I don't think we have seen exactly enough data to suggest whether one system is more appropriate, more fair than another.
Okay, well, thank you. Jonathan, would you like to add anything before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, so science has been called an invisible college. It is a communal process, and I find that when I review a paper, I learn a lot from the comments that are shared with me by the editor after the decision is made, the comments of the other referees. And I do feel sometimes like we are really in a kind of virtual conversation about the topic of a paper. There is a sort of broad criticism of the peer review process, which is that it tends to be perhaps a bit conservative, because where the reviewer is coming from, they're coming from a place of largely of consensus. And if there's a paper that really breaks from the pack, the argument is it can be really hard to get that paper published, or it can be hard to get that grant funded. It's really different from what the consensus happens to be. So some people have said, well, we really need to have some kind of a complementary process, like a prize system. And in a way, there's the agency known as DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, part of the Defense Department, kind of has somewhat of a system like that. They'll approach somebody like Alex, and write them a letter and say, well, we're interested in what you're doing, but we would like you to take it a step further than you might be funded for by the NSF or the NIH, because we really want to see if we can get this moving, with the current technology. How far can we push this?
Right. Okay, well, thank you all again. It's very educational. The next question is, how can the average person determine what has been scientifically verified and what is misinformation? Is there a way?
James Conant used to say that science literacy meant the ability to choose your experts wisely. Mm-hmm. And I don't see any way of improving on that.
Okay.
I think you've got a speechless. And again, we're befuddled, right? Because we're back to major institutions and people who've been validated by each other and by regulatory systems, by funding and so forth. It's really hard to get around that. And I think that, again, it's this kind of unfamiliar process that even to people like us sometimes seems really hard to get one's arms around, that creates some mistrust or skepticism. What is really, going on here? The words science and democracy are words that everybody wants to capture. You think of, Christian Science or creation science. Everybody likes science, even though they might not agree exactly what it means. And democracy, the socialist states in the Cold War, and still the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. Everybody wants to be democratic. So there's something so magic about these words, and people have this intuitive fascination with them. But who gets to control what it means to be scientific, or what it means to be democratic? It's a continuing conflict.
Uh-huh. Okay, so that actually follows into the next question pretty nicely. 2 parts. First part is, how does funding shape science today? And the second part is, how does a profit motive fit into the direction of research or the outcomes it produces?
I'll take a stab.
Alex, please.
Because my entire research program shapes the science that I do unilaterally in every single way. The research in our laboratory is funded largely by the taxpayer through the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, a number of private agencies, but mostly by the federal government, which, as I said at the beginning, uses taxpayer money through the NIH and other federal and the DoD, for example, to fund biomedical research, the biomedical research enterprise in this country. for somebody such as myself, who's a cancer biologist, largely due to the efforts of President Nixon in the 70s with the founding of the National Cancer Institute and the Cancer Act, really spearheaded much of the progress in cancer biology and the treatment of cancer in the last 40 years or so. So funding shapes in almost every single way how science is done. It has become a much more complex proposition in the 21st century, whereby science is funded by private organizations, industry, pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, whose primary goal, of course, is to develop drugs to treat numerous diseases, and in so doing, make a lot of money. And so, of course, that introduces a whole different agenda into the equation, and is largely not driven by the taxpayer, although indirectly, in many ways, it is. And so, laboratories such as mine and many of my colleagues are entirely dependent on our ability to propose grants that are reviewed by our peers, which then are either funded or not, and that is how our science is done. So unilaterally, science is driven by the ability to garner funds from the federal government and from private agencies, and it shapes how we do science. And so what science gets funded? Who determines that? Is it what disease you think is most important? Should it be more cancer? Should it be more diabetes? Should it be more neurological diseases? Who makes those decisions? And that is when legislation, the government, and not just science enters into the arena. And it's an extremely complex formula.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's as much as I love the NIH, it's no accident that cancer, stroke, and heart disease have been the big beneficiaries of funding from Congress, because most of Congress is all white guys like me, and that's the diseases that we mostly have to worry about. If you compare to the funding of public health systems is at best has been weak and inconsistent, particularly, but not only in this country. Unless there's an opportunity for a vaccine, there's a lot of basic public health, frontline public health that cannot be monetized. So we're seeing some of the problems with that right now.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't agree more, Jonathan. And if you simply look at major public health problems, perhaps not necessarily in developed countries such as the US or Western Europe, but in third world countries, in Africa and in Asia, where the major public health problems are relatively straightforward in terms of disease, sort of malaria. And those have actually received very poor attention, I would argue, from the NIH and other federal agencies. Instead, if you look at private agencies such as the Gates Foundation, who have poured billions of dollars into funding research and treatment options for those diseases in those countries, they far overshadow what the federal government and other governments around the world have done.
Yeah, following up on that, last time I checked, 89% of the budget of the World Health Organization was from philanthropy, including Gates, which is ridiculous. A World Health Organization where governments don't support the system is, that's just not sustainable, as we've discovered to our horror in the last couple of years.
Wow, that is very interesting. I never would have guessed that number was that high. Bob, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, let me just add to what Alex and Jonathan have said. They talked mostly about biomedical research. Let me just say that it's also true in material science. The funding of material science government funding of material science really sharply changed the field. After Sputnik went up, for instance, a huge DARPA was founded. A large amount of money went into producing materials used in missiles. Then the discovery of transistors and the discovery of superconductors. All these things were the development of material science was strongly shaped by government funding.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Now, the next question, actually, you've all sort of touched on it, but to the extent that you haven't addressed it directly, the question is another two-parter. Do we have to be concerned about big pharma, and are they pushing profits? Are they pushing their science for profit? So I think you've given some of that answer. Alex, would you like to take a shot?
Sure. by definition, pharma does push science for profit, because at the end of the day, they have a board, they have profits to make, and that is how they are able to develop the drugs, right, which cost an unbelievable amount of money. Sort of, I think most people, scientists and non-scientists alike, probably realize that it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to bring a drug to the clinic for a given disease. And that, generally speaking, only out of 10 clinical trials or 10 drugs that are initiated in the pharma biotech industry, only one will succeed and be brought into the clinic for use, and be efficacious in patients. That doesn't mean that the other 9 didn't cost anything. No, that is why it is so expensive to develop these drugs. And so it is understandable that, yes, they certainly the profits are required to be able to develop these drugs. Now, of course, this can be misconstrued, misused simply as a profit-making enterprise. And we've seen plenty of examples of this in last years that have gotten a lot of attention in the press, such as the extraordinary cost of insulin for diabetic patients in the US, which have been increased as a profit-making strategy. And I think this is where legislators, lawmakers, and the government really need to step in and enact legislation to prevent this kind of nonsense from being perpetuated. And at least I would be an advocate for that.
Great, thank you. Jonathan, you look like you wanted to say something.
The pricing issues in pharma are incredibly complicated. Right. Part of it is just as somebody who's now in the Medicare generation, the fact that Medicare isn't allowed by law to negotiate for prices in this country is absolutely scandalous. So yes, it's some drugs are way overpriced, but we've created the conditions in which that can be done.
Okay. I'd love to go down that path with you, but I think we're going to run out of time before we're able to do that. Bob, anything you want to add?
Just one small thing. As science, as I mentioned, is always done in institutions. There's no solo lone scientists anymore, and institutions are never completely altruistic. They always have their own interests. So even places like national laboratories, sometimes you wonder, why are they announcing this this particular discovery? Is this discovery very important? You always have to be a little bit suspect of the motives of an institution. More so, of course, for private institutions like private things like big pharma. But all institutions have an angle of some sort or other.
Great, thank you. And again, dovetailing here, the next question is: what are some of the greatest roadblocks to promote scientific understanding?
I'll take a stab at that, which is something I was going to end on sort of later, and seeing as we're almost out of time here.
Right.
And it's sort of, I think we've all touched upon this, but I really want to stress this, that I love what I do. Sounds kind of nerdy, but I really love what I do. I think it's a privilege. Being a scientist is a privilege that we somewhat take for granted. It's serious, and it needs to be taken seriously by serious people. And it's really, really hard. Okay. At the same time, I love what I do, and I recruit people into my lab who love what they do and have the same general philosophy and attitude. What we do, I think we do well. Where I think we have done poorly, and I certainly include myself in this group, is not being able to effectively communicate what we do and why it's important to non-scientists, to the public, to those people who actually fund our research, whether they want to or not, because it's their taxpayer money. I think the way that we communicate science as scientists to the public, we have done a very poor job in. The advent of social media, with all of its problems associated with it, has modestly alleviated this. But I think as scientists, we need to do a much better job of conveying what we do to the public, and not just our friends, close friends, all right, or our science colleagues, but to everyone. This is not an easy thing to do, obviously, because if it was easy, we would have done it by now. But I would argue that we really need to do a much better job as scientists at conveying information in a way that is understandable, and influences and conveys the message of what we do and why we do it.
Great, thank you.
Well, there happens to be a group at Roberts University supported by Alan Alda that is working on science communications, and there is a great need for good journalists to figure out how to explain what's going on in the world of science. So I'm hoping that we do produce a generation of people who can help us do that. I will put in a plug for a friend named Rick Weiss, who's running a program at the AAAS, the American Association for Advancement of Science, called SciLine, SCILINE, for journalists. They connect journalists to legitimate scientists. And I think this is really quite important to get the right journalists who want to learn, who will transmit what is science. Lots of scientists said to me, I don't like talking to journalists because I don't trust them. And I've had my quotes taken out of context, and I'm just not going to talk to them anymore. We need to connect the people who know how to communicate with the people who are doing the work.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned, Jonathan, the Alan Alda Center at Stony Brook. That's something quite remarkable, because the theatrical methods, improvisational theatrical methods, are used to teach scientists how to speak more clearly and energetically to the public. And there's some remarkable, if you go to the website, there's some remarkable before and after videos of scientists explaining what they do before taking the program and afterwards. That said, speaking clearly is only part of what communication involves. There's a lot more. Speaking, as Jonathan said, to reporters is one thing. Speaking to reporters is a special kind of art, and you can't just. It requires its own kind of cleverness and strategy. So it's a really difficult problem, and there's no single solution to it.
Great.
A lot of us have had media training. I don't know, Alex or Robert, if you've had media training. I have. It obviously didn't work very well, but it's a start.
I saw a special that Alan Alda featured about that program, and it was fascinating.
Yeah.
I wish there were a lot more people that were doing exactly that same sort of thing.
Yeah.
And now, as Alex alluded to, we're pretty much out of time. So the last question, again, we'll address it to each of you, is going to be, if there's one thing you want the audience to take away from this topic tonight, your conveyance of the education, what would it be? Just one thing. Bob, what would you say?
I'd say, for me, it's to convince those people who deny or resist science, it doesn't work to throw more science at them. Their own stories in their heads have already inoculated themselves against it. You have to use other means, more traditional means of persuasion.
Very interesting. Okay, Alex? One thing.
I would say that, just as I was saying, that it is our responsibility as scientists to communicate to the public what we do, our discoveries, in a way that is digestible, understandable. I would encourage, on the other side of the fence, people, reach out to anyone you know. Scientists, reach out. The internet is a wonderful way to reach out to people. Look, reach out, anyone you know, a friend, a relative, a friend of a friend, a relative of a relative, and reach out, have a discussion, be open-minded, listen to what they have to say. And if you don't like what you hear, just as with everything else in life, reach out to somebody else and get information, because the more knowledge you have, the better off you will be.
Great answer. Thank you. And Jonathan?
Have more science cafes. I think this is fabulous. I'm actually quite serious about that. There was a study a number of years ago. How many scientists do you know? And people tended to say, well, I know one, my doctor. And that's not a bad start. But actually, seeing flesh and blood scientists chatting in bars and restaurants, which I hope very much we'll be able to do soon off screen, I think this is a really great contribution. And I want to thank you and Robert and the others who put the cafe together. It's a great idea.
Very kind of you to say, and thank you very much. It was very educational. I enjoyed speaking to you all very much. So thank you. Now I have a few final comments for everybody. The reminder to the audience is that you can watch this session that we're just finishing up right now, shortly after we say goodnight. And while you're looking at that on our Facebook or YouTube channels, you can also check out the past sessions that we've run over roughly the last 6 years. And it's quite a varied array of topics that you may find interesting. Thank you to the audience. We are so glad you had turned in to see us, and we appreciate you spending your time with us. A very, very special thank you to an excellent and just an outstanding panel that we had tonight. Thank you for your time and your expertise and taking the time to spend some time and educate us on that. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. And for everybody, next month on February 16th, I believe, will be the next Science Cafe. We hope to see you then. And we all wish you a very good night, and we'll see you in February. So long, everybody.